The street was empty. Not the way streets go empty after midnight, but the way streets go empty when someone has been warned. A silver Chevrolet Suburban sat parked outside a mid-level residential building on Calle Federalismo Norte. Engine off, lights off. 3 men inside. They had been waiting for 40 minutes. On the 4th floor, a man named Rodrigo Salazar Vega was still awake. He had not slept in 2 days. His phone had gone quiet 6 hours ago, and in this world, silence is not peace. Silence is a sentence. Rodrigo was not a soldier. He was not a gunman. He was an accountant turned logistics coordinator for the most feared cartel in the Western Hemisphere, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. For 8 years, he had moved money, managed routes, and attended meetings that most men would not survive knowing about. But 6 months earlier, he had made a single phone call. Not to a rival, not to an enemy, to the DEA. At 4:51 a.m., the building's front door opened without force. The locks had already been handled. The 3 men moved in silence up 4 flights of stairs. Rodrigo Salazar Vega was found the following afternoon. The DEA case file that bore his name was sealed within 72 hours. He was 41 years old. The man who ordered it never identified, never charged. Rodrigo Salazar Vega was not born into violence. He was born in 1977 in Zapopan, a municipality pressed against the western edge of Guadalajara, where middle-class neighborhoods dissolve quietly into something harder. His father drove supply trucks for a food distribution company. His mother kept the household. Neither of them carried a weapon. Neither of them knew anyone who did. He was, by every measurable standard, unremarkable in the right way. Disciplined, private, methodical. He studied accounting at the Universidad de Guadalajara, graduated without distinction but without failure, and took a position at a mid-sized logistics firm in the industrial corridor south of the city. He married in 2003. He had a daughter in 2005. For 6 years, he lived inside the narrow margin between stability and ambition, which is precisely where recruitment begins. By 2009, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación was not yet a name most people recognized. It was still consolidating, absorbing remnants of the fractured Milenio cartel, establishing territorial control across Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Veracruz. What it needed was not more gunmen. It had those in abundance. What it needed were professionals, accountants, coordinators, men with clean records, legitimate faces, and the capacity to move numbers without leaving fingerprints. Rodrigo was approached not at gunpoint. He was approached at lunch. A man he had processed invoices for, a man with a registered transport company, and a handshake that lingered slightly too long, explained the arrangement in plain, economic terms. The salary was 4 times what Rodrigo earned. The work, he was told, was administrative. Logistics, nothing more. He said yes. Most men in his position did. Not out of greed alone, but because in Jalisco, in 2009, saying no to certain men carried its own consequences. The cartel did not recruit Rodrigo Salazar Vega. The cartel purchased him, and he walked through the door himself. The first year was ordinary enough to be dangerous. Rodrigo processed invoices. He reconciled figures across a network of transport and agri-distribution companies, all registered, all taxed, all legally invisible as cartel infrastructure. He worked from an office in Tlaquepaque. He wore a collared shirt. He drove home to his wife and daughter each evening. He told himself this was accounting. It was, technically. Only the underlying architecture was criminal. By 2011, CJNG had declared itself publicly, not through a press release, but through a mass execution. 35 bodies were dumped on the Guadalajara-Zapotlanejo highway in a single afternoon, accompanied by a signed narco message directed at the Zetas. The message was not subtle. Neither was the signal it sent internally that this organization was no longer consolidating. It was expanding, aggressively, and it needed its administrative layer to expand with it. Rodrigo was moved upward. Not promoted in any formal sense, simply handed more responsibility with no option to decline. His role shifted from bookkeeping to route coordination, managing the physical movement of shipments across state lines, synchronizing timing windows with corrupted checkpoint officials, filing the false manifests that gave those movements legal cover. He never touched product. He never fired a weapon. But his signature, or its carefully constructed absence, appeared on documents that moved hundreds of millions of pesos annually. By 2013, he had met El Mencho's financial coordinator directly, a man known only as El Contador Mayor, the chief accountant. A meeting with that man meant one thing. You were no longer peripheral. You were structural. This was the threshold. Men above this line did not resign. They did not transition into retirement. They did not move cities and start again. The organization had invested in them too deeply, and more critically, they had learned too much. Rodrigo understood this. He understood it the way a man understands the depth of water only after he has already stopped swimming. He kept working. What other choice existed? Every man who works inside a criminal organization constructs a wall. Not a physical one, a psychological one, between what he does and what it means, between the numbers on a spreadsheet and the bodies those numbers represent. Rodrigo had maintained that wall for 6 years with remarkable discipline. He processed coordinates, he filed documents, he managed timelines. He did not ask what moved through the routes he coordinated. He did not visit warehouses at night. He did not attend certain meetings. The wall held until October 2015, when Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez El Menchito, El Mencho's own son, was captured by Mexican federal forces in Guadalajara. The internal atmosphere inside CJNG shifted overnight. What followed was not grief. It was not strategic recalibration. It was a purge. El Mencho's response to his son's capture was immediate and totalizing. Someone had talked. Someone inside the organization had provided intelligence. Someone had given the federales the location, the timing, the vehicle. And until that person was identified, everyone in the inner administrative circle was a suspect. Rodrigo watched 3 men he had worked alongside for years disappear within a single month. Not arrested, not transferred. Disappeared. One of them, a route supervisor named Marco, who had attended Rodrigo's daughter's birthday celebration 2 summers prior, was found wrapped in plastic sheeting on a roadside outside Tlajomulco de Zúñiga. The official cause of death was listed as unknown. Everyone who read that report understood precisely what it meant. Marco had not been the informant. That was the detail that destroyed Rodrigo's wall permanently. An innocent man by cartel standards, at least, had been executed not because of evidence, but because of proximity and suspicion. And Rodrigo understood with absolute clarity that he occupied the same proximity, the same exposure, the same disposable position in a hierarchy that protected no one below its highest tier. He spent 11 days constructing the decision in his mind. On the 12th day, he dialed a number he had been given years earlier by a DEA liaison operating under commercial cover in Guadalajara. The call lasted 4 minutes. It changed everything, and it changed nothing fast enough. The DEA does not operate in Mexico the way most people assume. It does not raid. It does not arrest. It does not move without the explicit cooperation of Mexican federal authorities, and that cooperation, by 2015, was one of the most compromised arrangements in the Western Hemisphere. Under the framework of the Merida Initiative, the bilateral security agreement between Washington and Mexico City, American agencies were permitted to share intelligence, provide training, and maintain liaison officers on Mexican soil. What they were not permitted to do was act unilaterally, which meant that every piece of intelligence Rodrigo provided passed through a filter, and that filter had holes. When Rodrigo made contact with the DEA, he was connected within weeks to a structured asset program operating under the umbrella of Joint Task Force Coordination between American agents and Mexico's Agencia de Investigación Criminal, the AIC. On paper, the arrangement was secure, compartmentalized, his identity protected by federal protocols on both sides of the border. In practice, the Jalisco State Attorney's Office, through which certain investigative communications were routinely shared, had been compromised by CJNG at multiple levels for over 3 years. This was not speculation. It was a documented reality that several Mexican federal investigators had already flagged internally, without consequence. 2 senior officials within the state security apparatus were, in the most direct terms, on El Mencho's payroll. Rodrigo was never told this. The intelligence he provided was, by all DEA assessments, exceptional. He delivered financial routing structures, shell company registrations, the names of corrupt municipal officials receiving monthly payments, movement schedules for high-ranking CJNG coordinators. He provided, in the estimation of his handlers, more operationally useful material in 8 months than most embedded assets produced in 3 years. And somewhere in the machinery built to protect that intelligence, a machinery corroded by political compromise and institutional rot, a name leaked. Not a full name, not immediately, but immediately. A profile, a department, a physical description passed through the wrong corridor to the wrong set of ears. Rodrigo did not know this yet. But the clock, invisible, absolute, had already begun. El Mencho does not trust telephones. He does not trust meetings held in the same location twice. He does not trust men who ask questions they have no operational reason to ask. He does not trust comfort, not his own, not anyone else's. Those who have studied his organizational behavior describe a man whose entire survival architecture is built on one foundational principle: assume the breach before it happens. This was not paranoia in the clinical sense. It was method, refined over 2 decades of evading the most sophisticated law enforcement apparatus in the Western Hemisphere. By late 2017, El Mencho had assigned a dedicated internal security unit, operating entirely outside the standard chain of command, to identify the source of what he believed was a sustained intelligence leak. Several operational details had been compromised over the preceding 18 months. A shipment rerouted hours before a federal intercept. A safe house abandoned 40 minutes before a raid. The timing was too precise, too consistent to be coincidence. The unit did not use interrogation as a first instrument. They used observation. They mapped behavioral changes across the administrative layer of the organization. Who had altered their routines? Who had reduced communication? Who had become, in any measurable way, quieter than before? Rodrigo had become considerably quieter. He had stopped attending the informal gatherings that mid-level coordinators used to maintain relationships. He had requested that 2 of his route assignments be transferred to other handlers, citing workload. He had, on 3 separate occasions, taken routes home from the office that added 20 minutes to his commute for no apparent geographic reason. Each of these details, individually, meant nothing. Collectively, they built a profile. Meanwhile, Rodrigo had contacted his DEA handler with increasing urgency. He had sensed the shift in atmosphere the way colleagues who once greeted him directly now offered only peripheral acknowledgement. He requested emergency relocation. The response was measured, procedural. Forms to be filed, assessments to be completed, timelines to be observed. The organization had no timeline. It had only a conclusion. And in the final week of February 2018, an envelope arrived at a private address associated with El Mencho's security coordinator. Inside it was a name. One name. Rodrigo Salazar Vega. The order did not come loudly. It never does. Within CJNG's command structure, execution orders for internal targets move through a single, designated channel, insulated from the operational layer. Untraceable by design. The instruction passed from El Mencho's security coordinator to a trusted enforcer known within the organization as El Sastre, the tailor. The name was not ironic. It referred to the precision with which he worked. Clean, measured, no excess. El Sastre received the name on the 1st of March. He spent 11 days on preparation alone. March 12, 2018. Rodrigo called his DEA handler at 9:17 in the morning. The call connected. He spoke in controlled, measured sentences, the cadence of a man suppressing the specific frequency of panic. He described a silver vehicle he had noticed parked near his building on 2 consecutive evenings. He described a man in the lobby of his office building who had no discernible professional reason to be there. He described the feeling, precise and unambiguous, that the perimeter around his life was contracting. His handler told him to remain calm, to avoid altering his routine, to wait for formal extraction protocol to be initiated. Rodrigo said he understood. He did not sleep that night, or the night after. March 14th, 2 a.m. El Sastre's team positioned the silver Chevrolet Suburban on Calle Federalismo Norte. 3 men. No communication beyond what had already been established. The building's access code, obtained through a source Rodrigo would never have suspected, had been confirmed 48 hours prior. Rodrigo was awake on the 4th floor. His phone was in his hand. He had composed a message to his handler 8 words long and had not sent it. Perhaps he believed sending it would make the threat more real. Perhaps he simply ran out of time. At 4:51 a.m., 3 men entered the building without force. They moved without sound up 4 flights of stairs. What occurred on the 4th floor took less than 6 minutes. Rodrigo Salazar Vega was discovered the following afternoon by a neighbor who noted his door was unlocked. The responding municipal officers filed a preliminary report. Within 4 hours, the case was transferred to federal jurisdiction. Within 72 hours, it was sealed. No public statement, no named suspects, no acknowledgement of any intelligence connection, just a name on a sealed document in a federal archive, and a silver Suburban found abandoned 12 kilometers east of the city, completely clean. El Mencho was never questioned. He was never even officially named in connection with the case. He was, as he had always been, invisible, untouchable, and entirely present in every detail of what had just occurred. The DEA does not announce the loss of an asset. There is no ceremony, no acknowledgement, no institutional grief in any public form. What exists instead is a process, a quiet, methodical procedure of case evaluation, internal review, and damage assessment. Within the agency, Rodrigo Salazar Vega was assigned a case classification that translates in operational language to compromised and closed. His file was not deleted. It was buried, which in federal bureaucracy is a more permanent condition. What his 8 months of intelligence had produced was not nothing. 3 shell company registrations he identified were subsequently flagged in a parallel financial investigation. 2 municipal officials he had named were quietly removed from their positions, not charged, not prosecuted, simply reassigned into administrative roles where their access to sensitive operations was neutralized. A single shipment route he had mapped in precise detail was disrupted in late 2017, resulting in a significant seizure along the Veracruz corridor. By the DEA's internal metrics, he had been a productive asset. By any human measurement, that productivity had purchased him nothing. The 2 Jalisco state officials whose compromised communications had effectively delivered Rodrigo's identity to CJNG's security apparatus faced no formal investigation. One retired with full pension 18 months after the incident. The other was promoted. Their connection to the leak was documented in an internal review that was, and this detail is not incidental, never shared with Mexican federal prosecutors. The political calculus was straightforward. Exposing the leak meant exposing the depth of institutional compromise, and exposing that depth meant dismantling cooperative frameworks that both governments had spent years constructing. Rodrigo's life was weighed against that framework. The framework won. CJNG did not contract after 2018. It expanded. By 2020, the organization held operational presence in over 28 of Mexico's 31 states, a territorial reach that exceeded every other cartel in the country's history. El Mencho remained at large, with a $10 million reward posted by the United States government producing no actionable result. The organization that Rodrigo had spent 8 months methodically dismantling from the inside had, in practical terms, grown larger in his absence than it had been during his cooperation. He had known too much. He had delivered that knowledge faithfully, and the institutions built to convert that knowledge into consequence had absorbed it and produced silence. Consider the unsent message. 8 words. Composed at 4:49 in the morning on the 14th of March. Typed and held suspended between transmission and silence by a man who understood, on some fundamental level, that sending it would change nothing. That the machinery surrounding him had already arrived at its conclusion. That the institutions he had trusted with his life had processed that trust and returned in exchange a set of procedures. Rodrigo Salazar Vega was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a function useful to a criminal empire, then useful to a federal agency, then useful to neither. This is the architecture that rarely appears in indictments or official reports. The administrative layer. The educated men who keep criminal organizations operating not through violence but through competence. The accountants, the coordinators, the logisticians who transform raw criminal power into sustainable infrastructure. They are the invisible class of organized crime. They build the machine, they maintain it, and when the machine turns, they are consumed by it with the same indifference it applies to everything else. What Rodrigo's story exposes is not the brutality of one cartel. It exposes the symmetry of abandonment, the precise equivalence between a criminal organization that executes those who betray it and a state institution that seals the file of those it failed to protect. Both systems consumed him. Both systems continued without interruption after his death. El Mencho remained free. The corrupt officials remained employed. The DEA opened new asset files. CJNG expanded into 3 additional states, and somewhere in a federal archive, behind a classification code that will not be reviewed for decades, an 8-word message remains unread. The final testimony of a man who knew too much, trusted too late, and discovered that in the space between 2 powerful systems, there is no ground to stand on. Only the fall.